Welcome back. This is week 8, lecture 2, which is a workshop with the focus being on primary sources. And then also I'll be addressing the term paper. Now, this talk or lecture is probably going to be more involved than most of the other workshops because it gets at really the central core of what doing history actually is. It is offering me the chance in your term paper to begin to see what it is that historians do. Because history we come at as thinking we know what it means, the past, what happened, whatever. But that's not really what it is, because the past, or what happened, no longer exists. And I think I've said that before. But you can't show me the past. What is it that historians do? We don't analyze the past. We analyze artifacts that exist in the present. And on that basis, those artifacts signify that which no longer exists. We can't go back in time. If we could, that would cause its own problems of interpretation and understanding. But it is a way to begin to see the complexity of history and the complexity of what we're doing here in terms of history. And I make no apologies for that. I don't want to overwhelm you with the complexity, but I want you to begin to see it or sense it in terms of what not only is this course about, but what is history about, and how do historians go about reconstructing and representing the past, which no longer exists. How do we verify our accounts? Now, I think I mentioned that I have been working on for quite some time now. Mentioned in the previous lecture, some written lectures, I think, or maybe it's the introduction of the course, I forget which, but anyway, a major project with the title On History. It started out as a 1-volume work, and now then expanded up to 5 volumes, and now I think it's back to 3 or so, because I've published some of that material in other places. It's really a mess, and it's caused me to struggle greatly to make my point. My understanding for myself is pretty well set, but to argue that point, to make that point in light of what historians and philosophers for a long time now have argued is rather difficult. My point being here is that your textbook and my lectures taken together, that's not history in terms of what historians do. That's what historians produce. That's what historians produce. But what are those things based on? And it goes back to the evidence, to the extant artifacts, because once we lose artifacts, we have no way of knowing anything about, quote unquote, the past. I mentioned the lost sources. The Library of Alexandria is one of the stereotypical examples that this was this great ancient library, and it was completely destroyed. All those things are lost. If we had not found the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is only discovered in the 19th century, we wouldn't know about that. We wouldn't know about that myth that was created about being a good king. If we lost the documents, we don't know what was going on. And again, I think I said when I talk about Greece and the different stages of Greece, the so-called Greek Dark Ages, are not because that's not an interpretation that the people at the time were dark or backwards or anything else. It's simply to say that there are no extant sources. We can't see into that period. In some ways, and I've made this analogy before in different areas, being an historian on one level is like being an astrophysicist. When an astrophysicist or a cosmologist discovers a new star or sees a new supernova, that's measured in light years. How far away was this? And it is, 4.5 billion light years away, or 4.5 million light years away, or a million light years, or even 100,000 light years away. That's an issue of time. We're looking back in time. There's no way we have any insight into what the universe looks like right now. We can only know, based on the evidence that we can observe and see, what it had looked like, what had happened. So when we see a supernova, we can't say right now, somewhere out there in space, there was a boom of supernova. We can say that happened 4.5 billion years ago, or whatever it was, whatever that is determined to be the date, which is a problem itself in dating those events based on the evidence that we observe. Now, historians do the same thing. We observe artifacts that exist here and now that signify that which no longer exists. Now, I think I've said that, or maybe I haven't, but I kind of follow the great 19th century historian Leopold von Ranke, who's been much misunderstood. That history as a discipline is both science and art. It is science in terms of the analysis of artifacts, the actual physical things that exist. The art is what does that all mean? And how do we then reconstruct and represent what those artifacts mean and what they signify? So it is on both sides of things that the historian deals with, which all gets back to what does it mean to be human? What have humans done? What are humans doing? How do we understand how we got here? And all those big questions that are far beyond what is taught in schools, even at universities, that history is. That's why I've tried to problematize the whole concept of Western civilization for you, because this course, History of Western Civilization 1, so what is that? What does it mean? Supposedly there's a content there. Well, there is no really content. There are various representations of it, interpretations of it, understandings of it. And the issue is, what are those based on? And if person A says this is what happened in the Middle Ages, or in, let's say, the year 1000, and if person B says no, that's not what it was this. That's how we understand it. How do we solve that conflict? It has to be based on the extant evidence. Otherwise, it's just make-believe. That's what we're getting at. Now, that all applies to your term paper, because as I already said, your term paper gives you the opportunity to kind of have some insight to see what historians do, because that's what you'll be doing. You will be analyzing a document, an artifact. I'll talk more about that when we get there. And then trying to say something about what it means. So we're just going to start at the beginning, so to speak, and go through some of the issues here. Again, I'll try to not let myself get carried away too much, but this is something I get very excited about and very passionate about and feel it's important. We'll get there. We'll get there. So, looking at the slide, the PowerPoint slide here, if I can do this. After this has all been introduction, is evidence and how we know the past. And I've already kind of addressed that part to an extent, because the only way we can know the past is based on the present and the extant documents in the present. I may have included this in an earlier lecture, either written or oral, I don't remember, but it's very significant, I think. It makes an impact. I just recently, a few minutes ago, referred to the problem of lost sources and referenced the library at Alexandria. But it also applies to more contemporary history, or history closer to us. In 1991, I think it was, I was in Germany in the summer with a group of young American graduate students doing an archival tour. And we were one of the first groups that was allowed into what had been and still was in part at the time East Germany, and the archive in Potsdam. Now, Potsdam is kind of a suburb of Berlin, and it was in East Berlin. And we were the first group of Westerners, so to speak, allowed into this little archive. Archivist was very nice. I mean, this is just as the wall's coming down, but if you know anything about that, amazing summer. And the archivist took us down to the magazine, which is where all the documents are stored. It's called. And there was the smallest room, not huge, but not a closet. I mean, it was pretty. It was just filled with documents. And he says all of these documents here are all from the Nazi period, and they have never been looked at. You can say, how could that be? The Nazi period is one of the most researched, combed through areas of history that's ever been, basically. How could there be this archive with a room filled with documents so that no one historian could go through very much of it in their lifetimes? Never to have been looked at. Now, the point is that most of those documents probably were pretty insignificant. But how do we know? How would that change our understanding of what happened? That's the questions we're getting at. So the issue of artifacts and knowing what happened based on those artifacts that exist in the present, that still exist in the present, is the basis for knowing what happened. But can we really know? Or can we only know the artifacts? And then based on that, we interpret those artifacts and reconstruct and recreate accounts of representations of what happened or the past. We create the past as we're doing historical scholarship on the artifacts in the present that signify that which no longer exists. That is like, wow, that's kind of philosophical. It is, but that is important to grasp when we're approaching what history is about and how do we understand what we're being taught, what we hear, what we think about it, how do we think historically? Do we think historically simply as the stories of, how do we get from point A to point B? Partly. But thinking historically also is coming to an understanding to some extent of what history actually is and what historians actually do. History is what historians write from one perspective. But what historians write is not history. It's an interpretation, understanding, representation, recreation, representation of history as what happened. That's a difficult concept to grasp, but that's what we're struggling with. But that is the same thing that you receive in the textbook, in my lectures. It's not what happened. It is a presentation. It is an interpretation. It is one attempt to make some sense of the extant evidence. Now, evidence, artifacts. I have up there primary, secondary, and tertiary sources. This is point number 3. This is very closely related to point number 4, which we'll get to. And the only real reason I have this point here, primary, secondary, and tertiary sources, is because these are terms that are frequently used, often used. I find them to be extremely misleading because they're, in some ways, no set definition. Primary source is not a source you use primarily. A primary source are sources, documents, evidence, artifacts, as I call them. Anything that exists is an artifact made by humans. That's what artifact means, made by art. And I'm not talking about artistic works. I'm talking about just made by humans. What we can use as evidence, the evidence that's presented, that is the primary sources. Secondary sources are what other historians have said about the primary sources. Now, for example, I think I mentioned Edward Gibbon's The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire as being basically the beginning, the creation of the whole concept of the fall of Rome. As a secondary source, that is an important interpretation to understand and to see how that interpretation has impacted our understanding of what happened. We can also use Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire as a primary source, but not for Rome. We can use it as a primary source that reveals something about the later 18th century British Enlightenment understanding of the world. So in some ways, the distinction between primary sources and secondary sources depend on the questions that are being asked. That's the distinction that is very important. Tertiary sources are handbooks, helps, encyclopedia, repertoria, to find manuscripts, to find other documents. Those types of sources help in finding primary sources and secondary sources. And the difference between primary sources, too, is in some ways is the distinction between history and historiography, which there's point 5. Historiography is historical scholarship, what historians have written. Artifacts, as in point 4, are the actual things that exist, the evidence that exists to be able to say something about that which no longer exists, the past. Think about it for a minute. How do we know what happened yesterday? So, what do you mean? We know very well what happened yesterday. Well, we do. Why? Because there's a lot of evidence. Number one, there's our memories. Our memories, though, are selective and faulty. Do I remember everything I did and said yesterday? Absolutely not. So a lot of my experience of yesterday is lost because I don't remember everything I said and did. But yesterday, there is sufficient evidence, overwhelming evidence, of everything that happened. So if we were going to write a history of, what is this yesterday? I'm not going to go through specific dates. Oh, my apologies. My dog is walking in again. If we were going to write a history of yesterday in the year 2024, how would we go about doing that? We would have to take into account, if we're going to do it accurately, all extant evidence anywhere in the world. Artifacts that have been preserved. Now, that would be an impossible task if you think about it. If we take every book that was published, every article that was published, every newspaper that was published, everything that was done online, everything that was preserved or archived, we wouldn't be able to do it even for a very limited, small geographical region. We could not write the history of Indianapolis yesterday, taking into account all the extant evidence. So we have to be selective if we were going to do something like that. The problem with trying to do something like that is the evidence is overwhelming. How do we handle that problem? Now, that's not the problem that we have with this course in terms of Western Civ. Because there, the problem is the lack of evidence. We know so little, based on so little, at least comparatively, to know what happened. That should always render our accounts of what happened with an asterisk, so to speak. We have Barry Bonds. If you're probably showing my age, Barry Bonds, a great San Francisco giant, 49er giant in baseball, who had a home run record or some kind of big record, and that it turned out that he was using performance-enhancing drugs, and so they listed his record but gave it an asterisk. Every historical account should have that asterisk of this is based on, one, what is theoretically available in terms of the evidence, and then number two, what the historian presenting the account actually based their work on. What evidence do they actually use and present? That makes it difficult, and it, in some ways, you say undermines our very understanding of the past. Yes, it does, because it qualifies it, and it makes it so that we think of the past, that's clear and obvious, because what was past is past. All we have to do is go out and figure it out. But that is what is so difficult. And our understanding and knowledge of the past is always changing, because we're always coming to new understandings of the evidence. We're always coming across and developing new evidence. And in some ways, we're still losing evidence. How to handle all that? Now, primary, secondary, tertiary, I would basically say we should just condense that into sources and scholarly works. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot with here, but in terms of your term paper, the text assigned is Robin Waterfield's translation of Plato's Republic in the Oxford World Classics series. That's the text that you are required to use. There's an introduction there. Read the introduction. That's Waterfield's introduction. That is not a primary source. That is not an historical source. That is a scholar who translated Plato and how they represent it and how they interpret it and understand it and how they talked about it, how they translated it. When you read Plato's Republic or any other such document, you're not reading what Plato wrote. You're reading a translation of a text based on manuscript evidence. We don't have what Plato wrote. We don't have his original manuscript. We don't have really any idea what Plato actually wrote. We have copies, usually medieval copies. You see, that was a cat coming in. Sorry about that. I got this going, and then my dog busts down the door, and then one of our cats came in with the door being open. One of our nice cats. Anyway, we have some not nice cats too, but that's another issue. So the problem is, how do we reconstruct, to an extent, what Plato wrote? Because if we don't, we have a difficult time saying what this all meant for Plato. What was Plato getting at when he wrote the Republic? We think that we can just read Waterfield's translation and say that's what Plato thought. Well, we can't, even if that's the best we can do, if that makes sense. So just be aware that the artifact that you are reading and analyzing, Waterfield's translation of Plato, is not the same as reading Plato. Number one. Number two, it's the best we can do. And so we can still say, according to Plato, this is what he was thinking and saying. What is that based on? Our analysis and interpretation of the text that we are reading, which is an analysis and interpretation of Robin Waterfield, of the extant manuscript evidence, which are copies of some sort that go back eventually to what Plato probably wrote at some point way back when. It's so ephemeral. When I say the best we can do, we have to accept that that is our only access to the past, to Plato. I mean, obviously his other works as well. If we had just assumed that that is what Plato actually thought, we're going to misunderstand it. And yet we need to acknowledge that we have to kind of accept that as evidence for what Plato thought. It gets to be very complex. So in your term papers, you're welcome, and you should, must say Plato argued this, and this is what Plato thought, and this is what his argument was. But you need to know that that is based on your interpretation of another interpretation, which makes it rather ephemeral. We can't go to either extreme. We can't say this text exactly shows what was in the mind and the intent of Plato. We can't say that, and we can't say that because we can't get at that, what was in his mind and what was in his intent, that we can't say anything. So why do we even try? That's not what this is all about. Now, I could go on, as I said, I think, at length about this in terms of artifacts, doing history, and the problems and the complexity involved. I may have said that I think for me, doing history is the most difficult discipline you can study. because it tries to get at what were humans like? Why did they do what we did? How do we know what they did? What influenced what they did? Could they have done things differently, and why? And that is based on those questions. That is based on interpretations of evidence. So there's no set answer. This is not like, okay, we add up 2 plus 3 plus 2, and that equals 7. That's not how historical work is done. Now, we also need to make the distinction between historiography and history. I've already addressed this a bit. Historiography is what historians write. I use the example of Gibbon as an historical interpretation of late antique Roman Empire and how it changed or transformed. That is part of the historiography. What Robin Waterfield writes in his introduction is part of the historiography of Plato's Republic. He also goes through some of the important issues for understanding the text itself. So it's definitely read the introduction. And when you cite Waterfield, or when you cite the introduction, you don't cite Plato. That is not Plato talking. That is Robin Waterfield talking. So you need to cite it as Robin Waterfield, Plato's Republic, introduction page, whatever. And it's different from citing Plato. You don't cite book 1 of the Republic and then give the reference to Robin Waterfield. He's right. Plato, Republic, book 1. Parentheses, the references, translated by Waterfield, page, whatever it is. Now, I hope that kind of gives a brief introduction in terms of the complexity of what we're doing here. That not only applies to your term paper, but helps you to put this course in perspective and puts history into perspective in terms of these distinctions between the evidence that our representations are based on, and then our representations and reconstructions of that which no longer exists. Is there historical truth? That's a big question. Can we get to what truly happened? That's a big question. I say no, we can't. But we can get to the truth of an understanding. And we can get to a verifiably high degree of verifiability or certainty about some things that actually did happen, where the documents and the evidence are clear that something happened, which is distinct from what does it mean. We know, Declaration of Independence, that the British colonies proclaimed their independence from Britain. We can discern that. We can, quote unquote, prove that. But what we're doing is basing that on extant documents. Then what does that mean? That's a whole entirely different question. And in some ways, that's the distinction between history as science and history as art. The meaning is based on the history as art. The analysis of the documents, of the evidence, is history as science. And we need to keep those together. And that is the goal, at least the goal I have for you, in your term paper. Now, again, lest I talk for the next 20 hours on history and the philosophy of history and how I go about doing it and what does it all mean for us today, let's then get back to the practicalities and look at your term paper. There's a term paper, as you should know. I talk about it in the introduction to the course. There's a guide to writing the term paper, which I hope you have read. One thing I hope is that you will not put the term paper off until the last week of classes. It is an exercise for you, as I said, to try to adopt the role of being an historian. That's what this is about. Now, when you read The Republic, you're reading the whole thing, so it's not me saying here's just a small snippet. But you will have to select and analyze and say what is most important. You're given a problem, or several problems, as the guide to writing the term paper goes through and delineates. You have to analyze that problem. What is justice and what is the just state according to Plato? we can read this book, Waterfield's translation of Plato, in at least two different ways. One way would be to say, what does he say about justice, and what do I think about that? The other way is saying, what does this tell us about Plato's understanding and the historical context of the late or early, depending on how we go things, the 1370s, because it was written in about 1370, I believe, if memory serves, BCE. We can read it as an historical document. We can read it for its content as such, and both are valid. I addressed this in the guide to writing the term paper, because if I say I know what justice is and this is justice, and if you say no, that's not justice, that's injustice, this is what justice is. How do we solve that argument? Do we solve it by me being able to beat you up, or you being able to beat me up, so that you can no longer voice that position? Or do we just go to our respective camps and I know that you're wrong and you know that I'm wrong and that's it? Is there any way to get through those individualized opinions? And my argument is yes, there are. There are ways. And that is to be based on the evidence. To define justice is a philosophical question. So there's a logical basis for justice. And logic, this gets to be debatable and a long story. I've had long conversations over an extended period with Professor Samuel Kahn in the philosophy department, who's a good friend of mine, on this issue. But logic and mathematics are like common to human beings. And we can agree on things logically, and we can agree on things mathematically. So logically, we have to try to address that issue. How is justice defined? There is, though, no one particular answer. Even if we take Plato's view, because for Plato, there is a particular answer. That is, justice is this divine ideal, or it's in the world of forms. So there is something that is justice, and our problem is we have to try to discern it because we can't know it. So how do we construct the most just state possible? If we can't have a purely just state, how can we have the most just state possible? That's the problem that Plato was addressing. And that's the question behind it all in terms of the term paper. And you need to address it on two levels. One, what did Plato understand by it, the just state and justice? And number two, how does that apply to us today? Is it still valid theoretically or practically? Why not? Or why is it? On what basis do you make your argument? This term paper is not asking for your opinion. It is complex. If you haven't read the guide to writing the term paper yet, please do, because it is complex. Part of the exercise, so to speak, is to analyze the question. I tried to help you with that, kind of breaking it down and going through the different parts. And you will need, in one way or the other, to address those different parts in your term paper. Now, Plato has been read and studied forever, almost. Obviously not forever, because before he was alive, he wasn't read and studied. But in terms of the Western tradition, Western civilization from the 19th century on, he's been one of the foundational authors that define the Western tradition in some fashion. I'm not asking for your opinion. You should have an opinion. I want you to have an opinion. What I'm asking for is your analysis of the artifact and your interpretation of the artifact and how that is applied. That I can grade. I'm not going to grade your opinion, as I've said this before in terms of the midterms. You're welcome to your opinion. I'm not going to grade it based on, my opinion is different, so therefore my opinion is better than yours, so therefore since you disagree with me, you're not going to get a very good grade. I'm not going to be doing it that way at all. If you make an assertion about what Plato thought and what Plato's doctrine of justice was. You have to defend it with evidence from the text itself. You need to cite evidence from the text with page references given. Otherwise, you're just spewing your own opinion. You have to defend your opinion. You have to present evidence for it. The same applies to, let's say, I shouldn't even bring this up. Since Plato's everywhere, it would be very easy to use ChatGPT or some other form of AI text stuff and put in the question and press enter and then spew it out your answer. If the question was simply, what was Plato's concept of justice? That would produce for you probably a very good paper. The problem is, that's not how the question is formulated. I'm not going to go into ChatGPT and AI here and now, but the point is, it's stupid. I had a student turn in a paper a couple semesters ago using ChatGPT. How did I know? One of the ways I knew is because it's quote unquote perfect. And the other way is that it cited in a footnote one of my articles. Problem was, it wasn't an article I ever wrote or anybody else. It just put things together, constructed. It could have been, but it wasn't. The issue is that don't use it. And for this assignment, there's no way ChatGPT is going to be able to deal with the complexity of the question, nor will it be able to cite the translation, Waterfield's translation, accurately and precisely. Don't do it. This is an assignment that I hope you will struggle with. You should struggle with the concept of justice. What is justice and why is it still important? Should we even bother talking about justice? Do we want to have justice? Oh, we talk about justice. We talk about social justice. We somehow relate rights to justice. What is it, though, that we're talking about? That's why the question for your final, which also is a semester-long project, is looking at different understandings of justice and how that have played out in the development of Western civilization. Some of that is based on explicit evidence, like Plato's Republic. In some ways, we could argue like the Code of Hammurabi. Others of it is an implicit understanding. What made for a just state? We'll see that throughout the problem of seeking a just state and how that is defined. And what beliefs went into the definition of a just state. That I'll be talking more about that when we talk about the final, but there's a guide to writing the final too. But this kind of in a microcosm gives you a practice at the final, but also by focusing on Plato's Republic, it limits it to a very specific text. So that is how I feel that this can help with your final, because if you can deal with some of these issues here, your final will be less problematic because you've already dealt with those issues here. Which is not to say we just look at Plato's definition of justice and go through, oh, these people never followed Plato whatsoever. No, they didn't. Plato's Republic was not known in the Middle Ages. It was only discovered later, or rediscovered later, so to speak. So the issue is, how do we deal with this as historians, not as students in a history course? They have to learn the material and put it back on an exam. This is, how do historians deal with these issues? That's what I want you to have that experience, to struggle with it. How can you serve as a spokesperson for Plato? That's an awesome responsibility if you think about it. How do you know? How do you know? If you're trying to present Plato's understanding of views, not use Plato for your own. That's a big distinction. How do you go about doing it? That's the same thing with history in general. How do we come to an understanding of history that gives legitimacy and integrity to that which no longer exists in the past, so we can come to some sort of understanding of it rather than using it for our own opinions and beliefs? It's a messy, messy endeavor, but that distinction is so important between using the past and trying to understand the past in its own terms. And then how is that understanding related to our understanding today? What difference did it make that Plato saw it in a certain way? What difference did it make that Plato wrote this after the death of Socrates, his beloved teacher, put to death by Athens for undermining the morals of society? Was Plato being serious? I think I mentioned in the lecture. Or was he being ironical? Because the result of his Callipolis, the beautiful city, the most just, beautiful city, was this autocratic, dictatorial state that was far more similar to Sparta than it was to Athens before the end of the Peloponnesian Wars. How do we go about this? What I don't want in your papers is to read, for you to say, and Plato was wrong. Plato didn't understand X, Y, or Z about being human. You cannot say that. It can be your opinion, but you cannot say that. Why? Whether you agree with Plato or not, he's one of the great minds of the Western tradition. You don't have the ability to say he is just wrong. You are welcome to say you disagree with him for these reasons. That is okay. I've had students do that before in the course. And this is in some ways why I've signed this term paper. Just in response to the lectures on Plato, and then a discussion section or a discussion question on Plato, they just say he didn't know what he was talking about. It's like, what? You can't say that. You cannot say that. We have to understand Plato in his own context, and then how that context relates to our context today, and how this context of Plato's actually contributed to the development of our context and understanding. That's the key. Be sophisticated about it. I'm not saying you have to all be, same in Plato. We should all be, go back to Plato's view of the Callipolis. Even Plato, later in his works on the laws, did not advocate for implementing the Callipolis actually in society. It's an ideal construct. But his arguments bear pondering, consideration, reflection, analysis. Can we have a just state if our rulers do not know what justice is? Can we have justice in our society if we don't know what justice is? You should think about that, because it's not simply what I think justice is. Oh, I demand justice. What does that mean? That means I'm just using a big word to say I want to get a certain outcome that I'm labeling as justice. I want X, Y, or Z to happen because I think that is just. How do we solve that conflict if someone says, no, it's not? That's the question. There are, quote unquote, eternal questions of human culture, civilization, society, individuals that have no definitive answer. Justice is one of those. Now, there may be, in the ultimate sense, a definitive answer. That goes beyond the realm of history. That even goes beyond the realm of philosophy. That gets into the realm of theology. And or strictly power politics, because is political power that which defines justice? Or is it divine in one way or the other that defines justice as an absolute standard? Plato tries to offer a philosophical understanding. We need to think about it, I would say, if we want to have justice in our society, in our world. That's why I'm assigning this term paper for you. I think I'll leave it there for now. This is very much, again, a workshop, a lab focusing on skills, concepts of what historians actually do and how we apply that and come to an understanding of what it is that historians do. You may be saying, well, this is so philosophical, it's beyond me. I just want to know what happened. What did Plato think? My point is that that is impossible without a lot of hard work and sweat. And it's always provisional. It always has that asterisk. And it's of importance, not only for our understanding of Plato, but for our understanding of ourselves and our society today. That is the point. Within that, we have our own interpretations, our own opinions, our own experiences, our own backgrounds. That's all well and good. But we need to be able to defend our positions based on the evidence. Otherwise, it's simply a matter of taste. I think, Haagen-Dazs vanilla bean ice cream is the best ice cream in the entire world. You may say, no, it's not. It's, Ben & Jerry's Hunky Monkey or Chunky Monkey or whatever it is. I say, absolutely not. How do we solve that? We can't solve that disagreement. Because my taste is my taste, your taste is your taste. I cannot make the assertion Haagen-Dazs vanilla bean ice cream is the best ice cream in the world. I can make the assertion Haagen-Dazs Haagen-Dazs vanilla bean ice cream is what I consider to be the best ice cream in the world. Making it personally, for me, is my taste. Taste we can't deal with because there's no basis for solving discrepancies. I don't want to read essays or term papers that express your taste. I want to read term papers that express your analysis and argument based on the evidence. Now, if you have questions about the term paper, about anything I've said today, please just ask. The lab report 3, I believe it is due next week, at the end of next week. And I hope in some ways that all of you have already started reading Plato and been working on it. Again, if you have questions, ask. Let's talk about it. If you have practical questions about the term paper, if you have practical questions about the guide to writing the term paper, if you have practical questions or even philosophical questions about Plato, what did he really mean by the allegory of the cave? What is that all about? Contact me, email me, and let's talk about it. Because I think, again, this is so important. And this is a foundational aspect of why I think the history of Western civilization is so important. Struggle with it. Struggle is not bad. I think I've said this before. If we don't ever do anything that's difficult for us, that's hard, that hurts, we will never do anything in life. I have 2 boys. I don't remember learning how to walk. If some of you remember learning to walk, that's great. I don't. But I certainly remember watching my boys learn how to walk. And that is a difficult, hard process that hurts. They get up, stumble around, and they fall down. And they cry a little bit, and they get up and do it again. If we don't ever do anything that is difficult and that hurts, we will simply still be wallowing and rolling around on the ground crawling. Accept the challenge. Relish the challenge. That's what this is all about. Challenge yourself and see the brilliance of Plato, even if you don't agree with him. I mean, there are people who, in the past, we get there. John Calvin is one who I would argue is absolutely brilliant. And I disagree with him about a lot of things, most things, in fact. But we'll get there when we get there. With Plato, I'm not even sure I have come to my own understanding of what I think justice is, but I think Plato's arguments are so persuasive and so important for us to think about as we strive to somehow realize, in a practical sense, a just state, or the most just state possible practically. Plato's gives an answer for what it is theoretically. How do we relate those two? Anyway, that's. I'm looking forward to reading your term papers. Again, I hope you will not only struggle with this, but enjoy it and have fun with it. If you have any questions or issues, just let me know, and we can go from there. Thank you for your patience, and I'll see you again. Okay, bye-bye.